Hello everybody, happy October. I'm Alec Alger, the SideQuest Gamer here, and today I'm going to be reviewing a PlayStation 1 classic known as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Now, is it worthy of being called the best game in the Castlevania series? Well, I'm going to take a look at it and see if it's worth the hype.
So what can I say about Castlevania Symphony of the Night that hasn't been said before? Every video game reviewer out there gave their reasons as to why it's fantastic, but I didn't see why back then, why it was so beloved not just to Castlevania fans, but also to PlayStation gamers. Back then, if you were in a middle-class family, your parents likely could only afford one new video game system. Unless they were doctors or lawyers, you had to pick a side, and PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were both fantastic systems. Heck, during the 6th generation, the only system I had was a 5th gen Nintendo 64, and I was very happy with it. But I'll save those Nintendo 64 memories for later. One of the few differences of Nintendo 64 and PlayStation was that many franchises that were made famous on the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo moved to PlayStation due to more possibilities with CD-ROM technology that the cartridges couldn't offer, because cartridges could only do so much. Although Konami made Castlevania games for both the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, they were not that good in 3D for the Nintendo 64, and were so bad that Konami decanonized the games from Castlevania continuity. In 1997, Konami released the universally acclaimed Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation console. Sequel to the Japanese release-only PC Engine game Castlevania Rondo of Blood, the game was developed by Konami and was under the direction of, I'm sorry if I mispronounce this, Toru Higahara, with assistant director Koji Igarashi being heavily involved as creative influence. Igarashi was involved in the programming and story writing, and he wanted the game to head in a new direction the series has never gone before. Remember how the old Castlevania games were stage-based? Well, that's gone. Remember when it starred a Belmont or a descendant of the Belmont family? That's also gone after the first 10 minutes of the game. Remember when Castlevania was non-linear? Like Simon's Quest? Yes, but this was done much better. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest had you go to 6 different castle sections spread throughout Transylvania, so although the game was non-linear, it was also stage-based in a sense. The game takes place in one castle. Well, two if you spared the halfway boss, but even the two castles are heavily connected. If you played Super Metroid, Symphony of the Night is exactly like that. The paths are completely non-linear, and there's a map showing where you are in the large open game world. Some paths are blocked off unless you get a certain power-up, and there's a lot of bosses to fight. With the exception of the RPG experience point system, it's exactly like Super Metroid. But there's nothing wrong with that, since the game expands on its genre. I actually like this game a bit better than Super Metroid. As much as I love Super Metroid, the rooms sometimes look the same, and although there was a map, I found myself lost a lot on my first playthrough. But since this is the second series to heavily utilize this style for future entries in the respective series, this style of non-linear platforming was known as Metroidvania. Why is Castlevania's name in the genre, even though Metroid was the first to do this? I honestly didn't know until I played Symphony of the Night. It's mainly because Symphony of the Night introduced RPG elements like item shops and customizable armor and weapons, which was later used in games like BioShock and Dust and Elysian Tale, for example. Metroid may have introduced this style, but Castlevania Symphony of the Night perfected it. Igarashi wanted this drastic change in the series because supposedly he looked in video game bargain bins in Japan to find that many Castlevania games were in it. As an enthusiast of 2D games in general, he claimed the linear Castlevania games have limited replayability, and after beating the game, that was it. Originally, this game was planned to be on the Sega 32X add-on for the Sega Genesis. Konami sure dodged a bullet there. It's a good thing Igarashi wanted a longer game and not like action games that could be beaten in a few hours. Job well done, because the first castle took me like 8 hours to finish and I enjoyed every minute of it. This was a genius approach because although the game was long, it's not too long. Every boss battle is memorable, the platforming and exploration were exhilarating, and although this game may be around a 20-hour game on your first playthrough, it doesn't overstay its welcome. Part of this is because the game had the perfect atmosphere set up. The atmosphere is very suspenseful. There were times I was terrified, like how my heart races as suspense builds up, like in the Resident Evil games. This game is dark, eerie, and creepy like a Demon's Crest for the Super Nintendo, and the organ and choir music playing in the background adds to that effect. Like in the Castlevania Bloodlines, the music is once again composed by Michiru Yamada, and she's outdone herself this time. This is iPod-worthy soundtrack, and I bet Michiru Yamada has a stack of Grammy Awards on her bookshelf because her career in composing video game music is just phenomenal. There's even a few remixes of songs from Rondo of Blood, like the final boss theme from that game that can be heard in Symphony of the Night. The sound effects are well done themselves. CD-ROM technology allowed it to sound more smooth rather than a bit choppy like on the NES games, which was good for its time. However, as a near-perfect game, it is among the ranks of good games like Star Fox 64 and Resident Evil, which are cursed with bad voice acting. The voice acting is so lifeless that it's hard to take seriously sometimes. Sure, with an undead theme for Castlevania, it's only appropriate, but just hearing Richter Belmont say, "Die, you monster," to Dracula is a highlight, especially when Dracula replies with a random, "What is a man? A miserable pile of secret." With that being said, let me go on record to say that, like Star Fox 64 and Resident Evil, the voice acting is just so bad, it's paradoxically good. It may not make sense to you, but some of the worst voice acting moments in video games are the most enjoyable, like on this clip of Resident Evil 1.
Hurry! This way!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
It's just memorable, and bad voice acting are some of the most referenced lines in gaming. Even in other video games, these lines are referenced, like how there's a Fable 3 Xbox achievement called the Master of Unlocking, which is also a reference to a line Barry Burton said in the first Resident Evil. So what if it's bad? As long as it gives us something to smile about, I wouldn't have it any other way. The story first starts off with you playing a somewhat inaccurate reproduction of the final boss battle of Rondo of Blood. By inaccurate, I mean but instead of having a difficult time beating Dracula, Richter is overpowered in this fight and Dracula can be defeated in less than 2 minutes. This fight was made easy so beginners don't rage quit at the start. But then after Dracula is defeated, it flashed forwards to 5 years later where Alucard is running into the castle with a mission to destroy the castle since someone is trying to resurrect his father, Dracula. As for characters, instead of playing as a whip-wielding Belmont, you play as the sword-wielding half-vampire son of Dracula, known as Alucard. His real name, believe it or not, is Adrian Fahrenheit Tepes. He chose the name Alucard because he left his father's army to defend humans from Dracula's evil legions and joined a group of vampire hunters. Alucard is the backward spelling of Dracula, meaning he's the total opposite of him. He even eventually crosses paths with Trevor Belmont in Castlevania 3 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And let me tell you, in the 300-year gap in between the chronology of these games, Alucard sure has matured. So not only is Symphony of the Night a sequel to Rondo of Blood, it is also a sequel of sorts to Castlevania 3, since the intro and Richter heavily mention Alucard's partnership with Trevor Belmont 300 years ago. In Castlevania 3, all Alucard could do is turn into a bat and attack with fireballs. He used to have short black hair, but now has long white hair. He controls really different in this game because in Castlevania 3 he controlled very stiffly compared to Trevor Belmont. Alucard has a now more smooth, controllable jump, and he now can use weapons like swords, knives, or even a fighting gauntlet. He's really been at the hunting game for years. Alucard is at the castle with a mission to destroy it, but then he's confronted by Death, and Death threatened Alucard to leave the castle, and he took all of Alucard's good weapons and just disappeared. So as Alucard, you're now weak and have to level up and get better weapons, while going around the castle fighting various bosses and enemies. You later encounter a woman named Maria from Rondo of Blood, who is looking for the missing Richter Belmont. Maria is now around 17 years old, and she doesn't really serve any other purpose than moving the story along. Although she does give you a very helpful item later in the game that can really help you out with the halfway boss, which I won't spoil for you. Now, as for the controls, you have a 8-button controller. The X, triangle, circle, and square buttons, as well as the L1 and R1 buttons, are the only ones you use in the game. But the L1 and R1 buttons are only used for quickly scrolling down the item selection menu. It would have been better if instead of pressing up and square at the time, you use the R1 and L1 button for the acquired sub-weapon. It worked well for Super Castlevania 4 when the bumpers were used for the sub-weapon, but other than that, the controls are pretty comfortable. Square and circle buttons are used for each weapon or item you assign to those buttons. The X button is used for jumping. The directional pad, of course, moves your character. Now, if you want to pull up the map, press the select button. The start button brings up the very useful menu where you can assign weapons and armor to Alucard. This is a series first, and incorporating RPG elements really made this game a lot of fun. I occasionally had to grind for experience points, but it's not mandatory. You later meet a character known simply as the Librarian, who sells you items like better weapons and armor, as well as useful items like potions, the castle map, and the Jewel of Open. I recommend getting the Jewel of Open as soon as possible to open the blue doors you come across occasionally. It is a mandatory item for progression, so you might as well get it as early as possible. Enemies from the previous Castlevania games return in addition to new enemies. For some reason, the Igor from the first Castlevania game was renamed the Flea Man. I guess it makes sense, but they're just as annoying as their previous incarnation, with the exception that you have more health and won't die as frequently. There's also the Medusa heads, but a yellow subspecies can actually turn you into stone in addition to the annoying knockback. But there's of course the franchise staples like the skeletons and zombies, but in the inverted castle, these skeletons fire lightning at you, eating away at your health. There's also skeletons that revive themselves, kind of like dry bones from Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World. Some bosses return like Medusa and Death. I have to say, while Death is way easier to fight than his Castlevania 1 and 3 incarnations, but at least harder than the Castlevania 2 appearance, Medusa is much harder to fight than her previous 4 incarnations because now she has a sword and can turn you into stone. I have to say, the new bosses really shine. The hardest boss I fought was a giant zombie attached to chains. The flies take a lot of your health away, but be sure to have a lot of hearts and have an axe for your sub-weapon. You also get to fight a giant bat that's one of the few 3D animated enemies. There's also a giant bird as well as a succubus that you encounter in the nightmare coffin in the bottom of the first castle. Some of these bosses are entirely optional, but if you want a better item or health bar, I seriously recommend never skipping on a fight. But don't worry, they'll always be there, so it's never too late to go back and fight them. But some bosses are mandatory if you want to move into the next area of the castle. Or they may guard an item that you need to proceed through previously unreachable areas in the castle. Kind of like the succubus guards the silver ring that you need to get to the inverted castle. The graphics may be in 2D with the occasional 3D visuals, but the graphics, I have to say, are nothing short of amazing. This is one of the very few games on the PlayStation that hasn't aged at all. You can definitely thank artist Ayami Kojima for that. She's done a magnificent job with the character designs. Like I said before, the backgrounds are eerie and atmospheric. Like in the bottom of the area where you meet Death for the first time, you see a bloody carcasses impaled with spikes, possibly a reference to the real-life Vlad the Impaler, which Bram Stoker's Dracula novel was based off of. And it would explain why Dracula's first name is Vlad in the Castlevania game. Speaking of which, I really have to question its rating system. I mean, sometimes when you kill enemies, blood splatters out of them. Not only that, some backgrounds are disturbing, like the previously mentioned impaled carcasses. There's also a boss battle where you have to destroy the limbs off a chained giant zombie. Medusa is also worth mentioning. She has her breasts exposed. Sure, it doesn't show anything, and she's technically not human, but there's really a lot of elements in this game that could have easily gotten an M rating instead of the teen rating. The rating doesn't affect the overall quality of the game, but I think it's kind of false advertising in a sense, especially since a lot of kids under the age of 13 are playing teen-rated games, so parents be cautious. Finally, I would like to mention a powerful element in this game that was introduced in previous Castlevania entries: alternate endings. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest was the first to use them, and the endings on the game depending on how fast you beat the game and how many times you died, with the best one requiring mastery of the game, so you had to be speedy and not die a lot. Castlevania 3 had 4 alternate endings, which depended on which character accompanied you on your journey, or if you just went alone. Castlevania Bloodlines only had 2 endings, and they're pretty much the same ending, only with the difference being the character you choose. Rondo of Blood had many endings, depending on if you rescued all 3 maidens or if you played as Maria herself. Castlevania Symphony of the Night had a total of 6 alternate endings, but only 2 of them happened if you entered a cheat code where you either play as Maria or Richter. So there's 4 alternate endings just for Alucard. One where you kill the halfway boss, one where you kill the halfway boss while wearing the item Maria gave you to spare him, one where you beat the final boss with less than 196% of the game complete, and one where you beat the final boss with at least 196% of the game complete, or more. So if you want to get the best ending, you have to get at least 196% of the game complete, and by doing that, you have to find almost every hidden item in both castles. Not just the first one, both castles. And it is definitely no easy task. Symphony of the Night definitely has the best system of alternate endings, especially if you want to beat the game early. Later entries in the Castlevania series later use this system of alternate endings, but in my opinion, nothing comes even close to how Symphony of the Night did it. Overall, I would like to give Castlevania Symphony of the Night a 96 out of 100. This game is very tricky and with some occasional grinding and occasionally stumbling into a boss battle after getting lost and you're low on health. But this game is near perfect nonetheless, and easily not only one of the best Castlevania games, but also one of the best PlayStation games of all time. Sure, 3D games were in the norm in the video game market, but Symphony of the Night and Mega Man 8 proved that 2D games are not dead yet, and they didn't have to be in 3D to be awesome. In fact, those 2 games were much better than some of the 3D games that were produced. Many consider Castlevania Symphony of the Night to be the greatest Castlevania game of all time. And while it did a lot for the franchise, there's just one Castlevania game I like a little bit better by a decimal point in the percentage. Okay, you may be asking, what could possibly be better than Symphony of the Night? Well, there's just one Castlevania game that I liked a little better, and I'll review that one this Halloween. And keep in mind, I welcome disagreement. In fact, it was really hard to pick between the 2 games. One final thing worth mentioning about Symphony of the Night is that it actually got a Sega Saturn release in Japan only. One had a few extra rooms in the cast, as well as Maria and Richter being immediately playable. But the assistant director said that it was a disappointing port to the PlayStation game. Even though the Sega Saturn supposedly was more advanced than the PlayStation, it had very watered down graphics and stretch, and all the characters are very distorted. And Igarashi did not want to be involved in that porting development team.
Thank you all for tuning into this review. It took me a little while to get this up because, well, it's a Metroidvania style video game, but overall, it was worth it. Now, if you're new here, please subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate to have you here. And be sure to like this video and share it with your friends so I can grow my audience a bit. Again, thank you all so much for watching, and remember to stay awesome.